student, and this research is actually in the infancy stage. So I would like to beg for your pardon and your understanding. And I will be mapping out a lot of theoretical concepts and practices that are endemic to the Philippines, Thailand, and Indonesia. And I will be using quite a lot of terminologies. I will also try to speak slower for the translators. If I speak too fast, just please, yell out from your tiny box or send me something. Okay, so to begin with, the starting point of my research is actually this. I do not believe that what the human rights models of sexual orientation and gender identity and expression push is completely compatible with local and endemic practices and discourses of sexuality in the Southeast Asian region. If you're familiar with the Jakarta principles, which were developed in 2007, it very, very clearly maps out, but differentiates between sexual orientation and gender identity and expression. If I may quote, sexual orientation is basically about desire and the object of that desire, who this desire is directed to. While gender identity, on the other hand, is a more personal understanding of who you are as a person, as a woman, as a man, as both, as neither, or whatever. The delineation between sexual orientation and gender identity cannot be applied to the Southeast Asian context, because in the Southeast Asian region, we do not differentiate between desire and self-identity. And one of the reasons for that is, in the Southeast Asian context, our sense of self is rooted in the interiority of our spirit. You find this in discourses in the Philippines, in Thailand, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in Vietnam as well, where the interior is much more important than the exterior. And the interior actually dictates that your exterior should follow through it. I hope you can see the disconnect between Sogi and this kind, because Sogi says that your gender identity doesn't have to match a gender expression. Regardless of your gender expression, you can still identify as whatever you want. But in the Philippine context, and in Thailand and Indonesia, that cannot be so. These are the terminologies, so bear with me. In the Philippines, our word for gender is kasarian. The root word is sari, which means type. So literally it means a typology. So we're not just talking about, are you a man or a woman? We're talking about what kind of person are you? And in the Philippines, we have this childhood rhyme called, it kind of works like ini, mini, miny, mo. So you have the girl, which is the babae, the girl boy, and then the boy would be the lalaki, the bakla, and the tomboy. The tomboy, of course, would be the lesbian or the masculine woman. The focus of my research is the bakla. I'll talk more about the bakla later. This matrix is actually adopted from Janine Garcia's work on Philippine gay cultures. And he says that in the Philippine context, we have gender categories which are associated with heterosexuality, and gender categories which are associated automatically with homosexuality or non-heteronormative sexualities. So above you have the girl and the boy, the babae and the lalaki, and below you have the bakla, which is a male-bodied person, but internally female, and on the other hand, the counterpart would be the tomboy, who is the female-bodied person, but is internally male or masculine. In Thailand, the word for gender is pet, and if I may quote from Peter Jackson, pet incorporates sexual difference, so the body, gender difference, so your gender performance, gender expression, and your sexuality. So all these three concepts, which Judith Butler, tries very, very hard and very successfully to disentangle from each other. These things cannot be disentangled in the context of Thailand because they're all taken together. That's what makes a whole person. Your pet, your personhood, is a conflation of your sexual identity and your gender identity and your body as well. In Thailand, under the pet category, you have several different categories as well. It's built kind of like on a continuum. So on one end, you have the female-bodied people who are cisgender or do not identify with a different gender category from their assigned sex at birth. So you have the Puying. And on the other hand, you have the Puchai, who is the male, masculine, heterosexual person. Right smack in the middle, you have the Kathoey. Kathoey used to be a term that denotes people who incorporate both genders, so both genders and sexualities. But in recent contemporary times, Kathoey has come to be associated with transgender women, or ladyboys. In Indonesia, it's the same thing. So instead of pet, they have a word called jenis kelamin, sorry. And again, on the binary continuum, you have the wantia, the woman, and on the priya, on the other hand, the man. And again, right in the middle, you have the waria. What's interesting about Indonesia and the Indonesia and the Philippine categories is that bakla is actually a clipped word that combines babae and lalaki. So both male and female together, you have bakla. It's the same thing for waria. Wantia and priya taken together, clip them together, put them together, and you have waria. Okay. Another aspect of my study is the idea of genderphobia and homophobia, the ideas of genderphobia and homophobia. These scales were developed in 2005 and one in 2003, if I remember correctly. The transphobia scale was developed by Hill and Willoughby, and it kind of divides the idea of transphobia or genderphobia into three particular categories that work on three different levels. You have genderism, which works on the ideological level, transphobia, which works on the interpersonal level, and gender bashing, which works on, transphobia, which works on the individual level, and gender bashing, which works on the interpersonal level. I'll try to explain this furthermore when I put the two models together. Gregory Herrick in 2004 created the it's not really a scale, but kind of like broad categories that can be subsumed under the idea of homophobia. And just to make myself clear, genderphobia pertains to policing of gender identities and gender expressions. Homophobia pertains to sexual policing. So according to Herrick, you have heterosexism, sexual stigma, and anti-gay behavior. I've tried to put those two scales together, and I've come up with this combined model of genderphobia and homophobia. So you have, on the ideological level, genderism and heterosexism. On the individual level, gender stigma and sexual stigma. And on the interpersonal level, violence, gender bashing, and anti-gay behavior. The reason I put them together is, again, in the Southeast Asian context, you cannot really separate sexual policing, sexuality and gender. So the policing is not really that clear as well. In the films that I will talk about later, you will see that the policing is kind of ambiguous. It's sometimes, identities are sometimes policed based on gender. Sometimes they're policed based on the practice of sexuality, and it's kind of taken together as the policing of these whole entire essentialized identities. Okay, so let's talk about the bakla. In the Philippines, the bakla comes from a long tradition of spiritual healers and transgressors and social leaders. They were called the babaylan. The word babaylan is actually more, it's a marker for occupation rather than gender identity. It's more like calling someone a farmer or a weaver or a healer than it is calling someone a woman or a man. So babaylanism, being babaylan, it's a sacred practice And in the Philippines, again, womanhood is considered very sacred because you're able to bear children, and that's magical and that's powerful. So in the Philippine context, in ancient pre-colonial societies, men who would identify themselves as women or who would dress very effeminately and very femininely were automatically granted this position of babaylan. They were automatically seen as spiritual leaders. These were people who were, links to the divine animistic world. I'm going to skip through that. One thing about the bakla desire is that unlike the global gay identity or the homosexual identity, the desire is not directed toward other homosexual people. The desire must be directed toward heterosexual, heteronormative masculine men. So it's kind of frowned upon when two bakla people engage in sexual relationships. It's kind of like incest because we're supposed to come from this divine order of sisterhood, so to speak. So it's a big taboo for bakla to engage in sexuality with each other. So you can only direct your desire toward the otherness of the lalaki, of the man. With Spanish colonization, which began in 1521 and lasted for roughly 400 years, and 350 years, a lot of the influx of Christianity and Catholicism tried to police the practice of babaylanism because the priests basically saw the babaylan as their rivals. They were both spiritual leaders. They were both supposed to be celibate, at least when it came to women, because the babaylan were allowed to take on masculine male husbands. So, they were kind of like, they were rivals for positions in society. So what the Catholic priests did was to kind of ban the practice of babaylanism and code it as immoral and, something damaging to your soul, to your spirit. And again, in the Southeast Asian region, the spirit and the soul, the interior, is very, very important. So that kind of worked a lot in the policing of the practice of babaylanism. In the 1900s, when the Americans took over the Spanish colonization, the influx of psychological discourses which coded any form of homosexuality as a mental disorder kind of added to the policing of, babaylanism and being bakla. So these two particular discourses, Catholic moral discourses and American psychological discourses, kind of led to the loss of prestige in the bakla and the babaylan's position of power in society. Oddly though, there has never been a law in the Philippines to make homosexuality either legal or illegal. In other words, unlike Hong Kong, which has a very British, which is a British history of British colonization. You have anti-sodomy laws and buggery laws in India as well. We never had that. So the Spaniards kind of turned a blind eye to practices of anal intercourse. They just didn't want to talk about it. There are some current ordinances which protect human rights in terms of employment, education, etc., based on the SOGI framework, based on the human rights discourse. But these are small ordinances enacted in certain cities in the Philippines. But there is no national law that protects or safeguards these rights. Now, one very interesting aspect of being bakla or kabaklaan is the idea of sword speak. Sword speak is actually gay lingo. It's a combination of Japanese, English, Spanish, and celebrity names taken together and used in a very feminine manner to kind of talk about people while you're standing in front of them, but they can't understand you, even if you were speaking the same language. So this is, I think, one unique aspect of queerness in the Philippines and in the Southeast Asian region, because you also have this in Indonesia. It's not exactly like Polari, which is British gay slang, in the sense that Polari you can still understand. If you speak English, you can still understand Polari, you just don't know the meanings. if I started speaking sword speak, no one would be able to understand me, except other queer bakla in the room, and I don't see any, so maybe I should do that. Also, the baklas become associated with certain low-class professions like hairdressing, manicuring, and being a parlorista, parlor, so a salon hairdresser, and being couturiers. So a lot of urban middle-class and upper-class gay men don't like being called bakla. Like if you call them bakla, it's offensive to them. It's a pejorative for them. So they try to distance themselves from the bakla because the bakla is supposed to be poor and very effeminate. Interestingly, the transgenders in the Philippines coined the term trans Pinay, which is a combination of transgender and Pinay. Pinay or Pinoy is the colloquial term for Filipino. So if you're Pinoy, you have Filipino heritage. So to try to kind of localize international transgender discourses, the Society of Transsexual Women of the Philippines, of which I am a board member, full disclosure, coined the term trans Pinay in 2008, actually. The person cited here, Saswa, is a good friend of mine. We went to high school together. And her primary, she was one of the primary driving forces of STRAP when it first started. And the reason behind they coined the term was to purge the transgender identity from any aspect of kabaklaan, because kabaklaan is still associated with the male body and masculine performances. So if you've noticed, bakla in the contemporary use kind of has bifurcated in the sense that you have, on the one hand, the masculine non-cross-dressing bakla being called gay men, and on the other hand, the cross-dressing bakla now being forced to identify as trans women. When I first entered STRAP a few years ago, the chairperson, Naomi Fontanos, told me, stop referring to yourself as bakla. You are not bakla, you are transgender, you are a trans Pinay. And when I asked her, why should I abandon one identity in favor of another, she couldn't answer me. So that was kind of one of the reasons why I wanted to go into the whole policing of gender and why do I have to abandon one of my identities, which I've grown up with and I've come to love, in favor of a more Western idea. Does it give me more political leverage if I call myself transgender rather than bakla? Okay, the bakla has always been present in Philippine cinema. I'm trying to fast forward through this. As with most gay stereotypes in Hollywood and from around the world, we've always been associated with comedy. I don't know, perhaps it's a defense mechanism. Before people make fun of you, you make fun of them. So the bakla has always been seen as a comic character. In the 60s and the 70s, Dolphy, who is called the king of Philippine comedy, made his career out of creating these unusual, very overly effeminate characters, gay, bakla, queer characters. The title of this film, Pacifica Falayfay, is actually sword speak, an example of sword speak. Pacifica, of course, refers to the Pacific Ocean, and Falayfay actually refers to fan. So we call the fan a pamaypay. So you make it more effeminate, you turn it into Falayfay. So Pacifica Falayfay literally means Pacific fan. And then you have another actor, Roderick Paulate, who made his career again on gay characters during the 80s and 90s. The martial law bakla. I like to compare the martial law bakla, and this was, films created during the height of the Marcos dictatorship in the 70s. I like to compare these films to, I only have 10 minutes left, fuck, sorry. I like to compare these films to American New Queer cinema because the queers here are very, very subversive and they revel in their ability to subvert anything. Indie film, lots of sex. New films, really bad. These are the films for my study. I want to do Zombadings. Literally the name means, this is actually sword speak as well, patayin sa shokot. Shokot is takot, which is fear. So kill someone from fear. In English, it's a different translation. It's Remington and the Curse of the Zombies, of the gay zombies, basically. And Quick Change, which I saw at the Hong Kong International Film Festival a few months ago, which is very, very political. Okay, Thailand, hurry. Katoy. So unlike the Philippines, there is no history of colonization in Thailand, so the drive to modernize came from the government, which tried to standardize the language. And standardizing the language, you standardize identities. Follow me so far? Am I talking too fast? Faster? Okay. Okay, so you have a lot of different roles in Thailand, etc., etc. I won't go into them. What I want to emphasize is, like the bakla, her partner is actually the masculine man as well. The more masculine your partner is, the more real your womanhood becomes if you're katoy. So there's a lot of spectacle and performance. A lot of lady boys have a lot of shows in Thailand and Bangkok. And there's always this idea of sex work and the dream of the West. In other words, it's always been the dream of katoy sex workers to marry a white heterosexual man and be migrated from Bangkok to somewhere in Europe. Tragic katoy. Unlike Catholicism, which tried to police kabaklaan in terms of morality, the dominant religion in Thailand is Buddhism, and the approach to the katoy is more compassion, because for them, you're katoy now because in the past life you did something terrible. So this is your karma. You're already suffering. Why do I need to make your suffering worse? I mean, it's good, but not quite so good. Comedy, ladyboy films, and the Thai gay film. So there has been a movement as well of in terms of representation. They're moving now from the katoy, who's very, very feminine and more close to the transgender identity, to more masculinized gay portrayals. What I want to study is this. Insects in the Backyard, which was banned in Thailand. The story is, so this person is a katoy, and his children discover that he's katoy. So the kids have to kind of move around and then negotiate the katoyness of their father. And Love Next Door, which is basically their neighbors. One of them is a sex worker. One of the clients knocks on the wrong door, ends up with the wrong person. It's a comedy. And eventually the neighbors fall in love. Indonesia, Waria, it's the same. Dutch colonization. The Dutch were actually quite nice. Unlike the Catholics and the Spaniards, who wanted to kind of force the Filipinos to conform to their way of life, the Dutch were kind of like, yeah, do your thing. Just provide cheap labor and we'll leave you alone. So in terms of the morality aspect, Indonesia was able to preserve a lot of the Waria practices in a lot of their dramas, one of which is the Rogue dramas, the Ryog dramas. What's very disturbing for me in Indonesia, and I think I will use the last, how much time do I have? 5 minutes, okay. So just to wrap everything up in a supposedly neat bundle. In the Philippines, it's Catholicism. In Thailand, it's Buddhism. In Indonesia, it's not Hindu, God. It's Islam, racist. It's Islam that polices sexuality. And ever since the Reformasi period, which came in the early 90s, Indonesia has moved toward a more Islamic, a more theocratic government. In Aceh, for example, Sharia law, which is Islamic law, has been enforced in the entire region, in the entire province. Supposedly, when Sharia law was enacted, it's only supposed to apply to Muslim people. But the governor actually signed an ordinance saying that even if you're not Muslim, you have to conform to Sharia law. So now Sharia law affects both Muslims and non-Muslims in the Aceh region. Last thing, films, comedy again, and gay films. Actually, what's interesting with Indonesia is that they started with their gay films very, very early on. So as early as 1979, you had masculine homosexual portrayals. These are not Waria identities, but gay identities. Okay, what I want to study is this, not just because the boys are hot, although that is a factor. The story is a lot like in Sex in the Backyard, in the sense that one of the boys is adopted and he finds out that his biological father is now a warrior. So he has to negotiate through that as well. And this one is a comedy, Madam X. Madam X is a parlorista. She works in a parlor, in a beauty salon in the morning, and then she dresses up in a costume and fights crime at night. So how awesome is that? Oh, that's basically it. So thank you.
Thank you, Mikee, for being such a comedian. And my apologies too, because I forgot to give your structural identity in this institution. So, well, you already told us, but once again, Mikee Inton is a first-year PhD candidate in the Department of Cultural Studies at Lingnan University. And she really did a very good job, because previously she gave her topic defense in which she spoke very, very seriously. Today she turned into a comedian. Anyway, our next speaker is Denise TANG. She is from the University of Hong Kong, the Department of Sociology. So structurally, she has an identity here. Institutionally. So it's all yours, 30 minutes, and then lastly we will have Anthony Siu to give commentary on the two papers. Okay, 30 minutes.
Structurally, I'm at the University of Hong Kong, but emotionally, I'm with all of you. But Mikee, I just want to say a quick word. You have the film festival going on, just with your presentation just now, which I think would be wonderful if I can program it. For the Hong Kong Lesbian Engagement Festival. This is a pitch. So now I'm going to switch channel. I'll speak slowly, sorry. Yeah. Switch channel to use 廣東話去講我要講嘅 topic。我首先想講，我覺得用廣東話講咧係真係佢有一定嘅難度嘅。咁點解咧？就因為廣東話對我嚟講咧，不嬲都係好抵死一個語言嚟嘅。我嘅 topic 咧就一啲都唔抵死，亦唔一定致死，因為我係講緊自殘行為喺我呢篇論文裏面啦。咁你大家睇到咧，我今次個 proceeding 裏面咧，其實嗰篇文咧就係 cut 短咗好多嘅咁所以原文咧就大概係8000字嘅英文嘅一篇article。咁所以我希望我今日可以講一啲咧係除咗 proceeding 裏邊，你哋大家都睇到嘅咧，我再講啲以外嘅嘢，咁大家可以聽一聽，成個 thinking around 即係呢個 topic 嘅。首先我諗好多人都知道過去10年裏面咧，我哋講親性傾向或者係自殘相關嘅研究咧，都有好穩定嘅成長，一路都係講緊呢樣嘢嘅，好多時都。但喺香港咧，其實講自殘咧咁就少啲嘅 ，in terms of 即係講關於，尤其是係關於同志或者即係你講緊LGBT 嘅健康或者呢方面做數字研究咧係好少人去掂嘅。咁最初我想做呢個研究嗰陣時候咧，我成日都同你講咧，即係笑話嚟講咧，就係想搞年青嘅女仔咁樣，係咪？搞靚妹咁樣。點解咧？因為其實自殘嘅年齡咧係好低嘅，即係你講緊我做完呢個研究之後咧，我發現真係即係我講緊話即係戒手或者即係戒手係一個例子啦嘅研究嘅，通常而家啲女仔都係8、9歲開始戒手㗎啦，係啊。咁我一入去想做嗰陣時候咧，我知道我嘅身份喺香港嘅身份，我個樣又好，我自己成個學術上嘅身份又好，或者搞同志影展嘅身份又好咧。係好難接觸到中學或者小學嘅學生嘅，我冇一個好 clinical 嘅 background 去做呢件事，咁所以咧，我最初諗好想做一個咁嘅研究嗰陣時候咧，就係諗我一定要訪問一啲 service provider 先嘅。我希望從我訪問呢啲 service provider 裏面咧，我可以接觸一啲人， 可以之後俾我訪問又好，或者我可以通過佢哋去了解多啲嗰個 structural 嘅情況，係咪？咁令到我可以慢慢接觸一啲個案去同我傾偈。咁喺成個過程裏面嗰陣時候咧，做呢個研究同啲 service provider 傾偈嗰陣時候咧，就其實好多 service provider 同我講咧，佢哋自己係自殘嘅，成件即係佢自己都有呢個嘅自殘嘅傾向嘅。咁我就發現其實喺我諗緊做完呢個 project 之後咧，第二步嗰陣時候咧，就其實係要闊啲去睇自殘係一個 project 啦，係一個 health issue 嚟講，係，亦都唔可以淨係歸納喺一個比較或者係比較大家會覺得可能係比較小眾嘅一個問題。咁但係當然我個 loyalty， 你講我個 loyalty 嘅話咧，我仍然係好緊張，係比較上係即係你話 LGBT 嗰種嘅 health 嘅 public health 嘅 issue 嘅，亦都係我以前做 NGO 嘅背景，都係做即係 LGBT 做 public health 嘅 issue 嘅。咁我諗在座有好多位咧，都可能都知道有呢啲嘅，有幾個PowerPoint 即係嗰幾個 background 我呢個香港做呢個研究啦，係咪？例如我哋有好多保守嘅基督新教啊、天主教組織啦，好似明光社同埋香港維護家庭聯盟啦，佢哋都係有登廣告，或者亦都係通過好廣泛嘅佢哋嘅最近用 WhatsApp 啦，去同大家溝通。咁佢點解覺得真係有逆向歧視危險啦？或者係佢哋點樣睇香港希望將會立法保障性小眾呢件事，係咪免受社會歧視件事嘅？咁除咗宗教之外，其實咧教育方面咧，我哋都好 screw up 嘅，係咪？最主要就係咧喺我訪問好多嘅 service provider 嗰陣時候咧，大部分人都會同我講話，佢哋未聽過 sex education 啦。喺我自己教學都係好多學生都會話我哋冇上過 sex education 嘅。而如果有上 sex education 嗰陣時候咧，通常都係一啲係一係咧就係唔講，一係咧就係講啲只不過係就係即係你結咗婚就可以有sexual behaviour 嘅信息啦。咁呢個我諗都唔係太 surprising 嘅。而喺香港已經大概有超過50% 嘅中學係隸屬教會組織啦，而更多數嘅健康診所或者係一啲社會服務機構或者啲 youth centre 都係全部有宗教背景嘅。咁就係基於咁樣呢個咁樣嘅 background 咧，就令到其實我哋想講關於同性戀嘅議題咧，就永遠都係好邊緣化嘅。而我做我嘅研究嗰陣時訪問嘅人咧，有啲都係喺一啲比較 mainstream 嘅 youth centre 嘅，即係分區啊，或者係一啲我哋認為好 mainstream 嘅中心裏面去同佢哋傾偈嘅。LGBT 作為一個即係我覺得作為一個群體嚟講咧，好大程度上咧被醫療服務或者任何嘅 mental health support 嘅 services 咧都忽視嘅，係唔夠足夠嘅喺香港。如果你問我嘅話，如果有嘅話咧，都可能係太過 structural， 太過用一種都係比較上係唔係從一個 youth empowerment 嘅 model 出嘅，亦都唔係好 queer 嘅 model 去睇一個 LGBT 群體嘅。咁所以我覺得，例如我就 quote 咗有啲 studies 嘅，譬如喺香港咧，其中一個 studies 就係香港大學有超過25% 嘅醫科生咧係贊同性戀係一種心理疾病係需要治療嘅。咁你諗下將來同你睇醫生嗰啲人咧就係咁諗噶啦，係咪？跟住另外一個研究咧就係喺香港3間大學裏面462個社工系嘅華人學生為樣本，就係喺佢哋收集嘅 sample 裏面顯示咧。有基督教信仰嘅學生傾向對女同志同埋男同志持負面嘅態度咧，我哋可以話將來喺呢啲 centre 裏面做嘢嘅社工好多時就有咁嘅想法。即係你咁樣聽嘅之後，你就會覺得就好明白到點解成個制度上都係好污名化LGBT 個群體嘅。咁喺自殘嘅概念上面咧，其實就兩種喺啲 literature 裏面咧，就兩種唔同嘅 approach 嚟嘅。通常就唔係 clinical 咧，通常大部分都係 clinical 噶啦，同埋做 quanti 嘢嘅quantitative 嘅，咁就好少人做 sociology of 自殘嘅概念嘅。而通常好 clinical 嗰啲咧，就真係講緊話入醫院噶啦，介到入醫院啊，講緊一啲係好 mental health issue 啊，都係講緊一啲仍然如果你話喺 Western literature 裏面咧，就通常係女仔啦。係白人啦、年輕啦同埋中產階級嘅人至介自己嘅啫。 而用數字嘅方法去睇嘅話咧，咁就會睇得闊啲啦，就會睇多啲經濟嘅因素啦，同埋究竟咧除咗經濟因素以外咧，就係你家庭嘅因素啦，另外就係譬如社會另外一啲嘅 social factor 啦，好似你啲教育啊，或者另外各方面去睇點解會影響一個人咧，係比較有自殘嘅傾向嘅。而我呢個研究裏面咧，都係用數字嘅方法去睇自殘嘅傾向嘅。咁即係我嘅定義咧，就係故意傷害身體表面，主要係通過割劃，但亦包括即係拗自己啊、燙自己啊、咬啊、打嘅呢幾方面嘅。即係我睇得比較闊啲嘅，希望係咁樣睇嘅。但係我就冇掂到drugs 同埋 alcohol 嘅，呢兩方面我就未掂嘅，係啦。即係喺今次呢個研究裏面先做咗呢一部分先，跟住之後就再放翻闊佢嘅。咁喺香港，你話香港青年同自殘咧，其實我學校香港大學咧最呢個自殘王傾就係 Paul Yip 係啦，咁佢就專係做好多關於香港嘅young people 嘅 suicide 啊自殘嘅研究嘅，佢真係好 dominant 㗎啦喺呢個 field 嗰度。咁佢都係做好多 quantitative 嘅嘢嘅，咁佢都亦都係睇到有呢個趨向，即係香港中學生係好多自殺嘅唔同自殺嘅因素啦，但係咧。佢就冇睇 sexuality 嘅，佢就唔好掂同志自殘或者係自殺呢一方面嘅，冇乜唔好碰呢個 topic 嘅。而另外咧，社會科學者Denise 啦同埋 Louis 咧，佢哋咧就收納咗都係做咗個 quantitative 嘅research 咧，係關於啲學生，亦都係睇翻佢哋咧喺過去1年裏面咧有冇一次嘅自殘嘅行為嘅。咁喺嗰篇 proceeding 裏面咧就有咗啲嘅statistic 去講俾大家聽係有10.4% 嘅人會即係拗自己拗到出晒血啊咁樣嘅。咁你話 LGBT 青少年同埋自殘嘅話咧，喺好多研究裏面咧都 point out 咗個即係好耐咧嚟講咧 LGBT 青少年咧係有較高嘅自殘嘅比率嘅，比起異性戀嘅青少年嚟講。而有關 LGBT 青少年嘅健康需求咧，就出現咗越嚟越多嘅證據顯示，年青人如果對於性別認同或者性傾向感到掙扎咧，佢哋係較容易咧係有自殘行為或者自殺嘅傾向嘅。咁呢個其實都唔係完全唔係一個 new 即係 finding 或 new understanding， 呢個其實已經大家都我諗都知道咗好耐嘅。咁唯一特別之處，即係當然就係你知道咗之後，下一步做咩咧？我哋點樣可以即係喺香港嘅社會裏面點樣去回應，即係既然你都知道有呢件事嘅話咧，或者呢啲狀況嘅話咧，究竟我哋可以做到啲乜嘢啦？係咪？呢個我都係覺得自己比較有興趣，想知道可以做到啲咩 support 嘅，有啲咩 implication 啊，或者 policy implication 喺成個議題上面嘅。嗱，小童群益會咧係做咗一個佢嘅性向無限計劃咧，都做咗一個網上嘅問卷調查嘅。就顯示咗咧，喺492位向同學出櫃表示係同志嘅中學生受訪者中咧，係有53.1% 咧係經歷咗唔同程度嘅排斥同埋隔離嘅。咁喺香港，我哋同志嘅 term 大家應該有可能都知道呢個詞係成日都被認為係一種比較政治化嘅性身份啊，亦都係表明擁有同性情慾嘅個人嘅身份嘅。但係就唔係個個人都用同志嚟identify 自己嘅，咁所以就係其實因為呢篇文嘅 proceeding 裏面短啲，但我原本嘅 article 就做得比較 thorough 嘅一個 literature review 去講嘅。咁基於嗰個 literature review 咧，其實我就諗到一啲 research questions 嘅，就係有3條嘅，就喺提供指導同埋諮詢服務俾擁有同性情慾嘅青少年方面咧，助人工作者會受到邊啲機構同埋個人因素嘅影響。所以就係又係 structural， 亦都係佢 individual 有啲咩影響，佢咁樣點睇嘅。第二個 research question 咧，就喺同性情慾同埋自殘之間咧，有啲乜嘢潛在嘅因果聯繫？咁呢個就係睇下有冇啲乜嘢嘅，真係你講緊cause effect 嗰種嘅connection 啦。而第3條問題咧，就係教育工作者同埋社會工作人員對自殘同埋性或者性慾特質 Sexualities 嘅唔同嘅觀念，會造成咗一個咩影響咧？係啦，咁頭先我都解釋過點解我冇可能而家暫時冇可能直接咧先同啲年青人傾偈住先，我想做咗大圍先啊！我想做咗一個研究係人哋點睇佢哋先啊！即係同你真係即係你啲老師啊、你啲社工啊、 suppose 喺一啲好 progressive 嘅 youth centre 裏面做嘢嘅人點睇啊？點睇佢哋先？跟住我就再翻去咧，同佢哋傾偈，即係同啲 youth 去傾偈嘅。我係即係咁樣去design 嘅。咁我個 methodology 咧就係質化嘅 qualitative 嘅。咁我就同16個 participant 傾偈啦，傾咗好耐啦。咁就有7個係社工，6個係老師，中學老師，有3個係即係 community worker/activist 嘅人啦。我問佢哋啲問題咧，其實都係關於香港嘅青少年文化啦、youth culture 啦，佢點睇自殘啦，佢自己有冇自殘傾向啦，自殺啦、gender 嘅 identity 啦、sexuality 啊，點睇香港教育制度係啦呢方面啦。我亦都有問佢哋喺學校裏面可唔可以講關於同志嘅議題，可唔可以講關於性啊、自殘呢啲咁嘅議題啊？佢哋點樣同如果佢哋知道係 LGBT 嘅學生傾偈嗰陣時候，佢哋會俾佢啲乜嘢嘅 support 啦，或者唔俾佢啲咩 support 啦？呢種 counselling 嘅 strategy 啦，同埋佢哋嘅 coping mechanism。而我覺得呢個 coping mechanism 咧就兩睇嘅，即係佢哋自己要 cope 啦。即係點樣自己去 cope with？如果突然間自己嘅信仰係比較保守嘅，而我要 cope with 一斬啊，咁即係後生嘅已經好 empowered 嘅同志同學們嚟同我講關於自己嘅情慾經驗嗰陣時，我自己要點 cope with 佢哋啦，同埋佢點教，即係點 counsel 佢哋，俾 support 佢哋去 cope with 佢哋自己嗰個身份嘅性別身份啦。咁跟住我個data analysis 係grounded theory 嘅。咁其實喺呢一方面咧，咁我就outline 咗幾個我揾到嘅 research finding 嘅，係好初步嘅 research finding 嚟嘅。咁其實每一個 PowerPoint 到每一點咧都有啲故仔可以聽嘅。咁喺個 proceeding 裏面咧就 list 咗有啲故仔，即係有啲 interview 我嗰啲故仔嗰啲 quotes 啊咁樣去講翻呢件事嘅。譬如第一個point 咧就係個 obstructive barriers to discussing sexuality in schools 啦。咁其實好喺香港學校咧，可以講性啦，或者講關於性嘅特質咧，就好多阻礙性嘅障礙啦，你可以想像到啦。例如我其中有個同我一個 informant 啦，就係40歲嘅 Karen 啦，佢自己已經做到一個 program manager 嘅 position 嘅啦。咁即係話佢其實係 supervise 好多社工嘅，而呢啲社工咧就可以去學校裏面咧做 intervention， 或者咧喺嗰個機構裏面做 intervention 嘅。咁佢就發現啊，一個 program manager 佢自己其實咧就係好 supportive 嘅，即係LGB 嘅同學們嘅。咁但係咧，佢發覺佢啲 staff 咧唔係太 supportive， 唔係個個好 supportive 嘅。咁佢就自己咧要諗個辦法去同佢哋溝通，去令到佢哋明白即係你嘅工作咧就係要 in some ways 係 supportive of 呢啲LGBT 學生，或者如果你即係你有一個學生嚟到同我講話，即係我介紹到入醫院啦。咁我但係我係同志嚟嘅。咁但係我知道你即係嘅宗教信仰咧係唔 support 呢個議題嘅，即係唔 support 同志嘅，係恐同嘅。其實 in some ways 係咪？咁我as一個員工，我又as一個你嘅supervisor 嘅話咧，我要點樣同你去傾呢樣嘢？你可唔可以抽離到個人咧喺你 provide 呢啲 services 裏面？咁喺我呢個研究裏面咧，我覺得好多人係抽離唔到好個人嗰方面嘅。咁但係因為你要諗到呢啲咁嘅 counselling 嘅 sessions， 好多時咧就係呢位同學同埋呢個社工，有陣時咧就有埋個中學老師喺間房裏面啦，係咪？大家一齊咁樣傾嘅。咁喺間房裏面呢啲 intervention 嗰陣時候做嗰陣時候咧，其實好多時候我哋都控制唔到究竟你係咪 supportive of 呢啲同學嘅性傾向嘅，係咪？咁你嘅 as 一個 program supervisor 好似 Karen 咁樣咧，佢只可以話好啦 ，as from 一個 structural 嘅perspective 咧，你哋係應該即係 supportive 嘅 of LGBT 學生。但係我其實唔可以即係點樣去即係 make sure ensure 個 quality control of 呢啲嘅intervention 嘅。而喺我嘅研究裏面咧，我同好多譬如如果個人好強烈嘅宗教嘅信仰，而嗰個宗教信仰咧係 in opposition to 同志議題嘅話咧，佢哋係好難真係覺得自己係可以去到一個位咧，係 support 到呢啲同學嘅。咁其中有一個我記得同我傾偈傾得最耐嘅，我亦都覺得係最有啲最驚訝嘅一個informant咧， 就係其實就歸結喺我第二嗰個 point 嘅，就係講 personal disinclination of religion 嘅嗰方面嘅。咁同我傾偈呢位社工咧叫 Fiona 嘅，咁佢28歲，咁其實佢係一個佢都come out係一個虔誠嘅基督徒，咁佢服務對象係大概13至15歲嘅 LGBT 嘅年青人啦。咁而佢嘅服務對象裡面咧，佢都噏到有啲 case 咧係真係戒手戒到入醫院啊，戒好多次啊，嗰啲 case 佢都接觸幾多嘅。咁我同佢傾偈嗰陣時候咧，咁就我咁嘅樣，跟住同埋我嘅 TA， 我 TA 啦同我嘅樣都差唔多嘅，咁即係兩嚿咁好似個 TB 咁樣嘅人坐喺佢面前啦，係咪？咁就大家傾偈啦，咁就傾即係佢究竟點樣去 deal with 呢個即係呢個 case 啦。咁其實我諗我成件事咧喺即係如果你睇翻個 conference proceeding 裏面咧，就知道譬如我係好直接咁樣同佢傾偈嘅，直接問佢嘅，問佢自己個人嘅矛盾啊喺成件事。咁 Fiona 就咁樣答我嘅。如果你真係要問我關於我自己，我的確係有唔贊同同性戀傾向嘅宗教立場，因為你知道宗教有佢自己嘅理由。但當我睇到教堂或者學校裏面嘅年青人，我要假裝即係扮乜都冇嘅話咧，即係話我扮我係冇立場嘅時候咧，我就覺得其實我就一定要扮我自己係冇立場，因為我覺得啲年青人仲喺度探索緊嘅，所以我唔會認定佢哋真係攣嘅，定係唔真係攣嘅嚇。咁佢會咁樣去界定，即係佢自己嘅個人矛盾嘅。而 Fiona 喺度討論緊，即係關於即係呢個男同學戒手戒得好勁嗰個男同學嗰陣時候咧，佢就呢個男同學其實係真係好聰明㗎，係啊，佢真係完全讀書好叻㗎。佢係一定會畢業，中學畢業，同埋一定會讀即係 high dip， 起碼 high dip。如果唔係一定入大學嘅，一定冇乜問題嘅。咁但係 Fiona 喺我同佢傾偈嘅過程裏面咧，我哋大家嘅 struggle 就係佢覺得佢哋冇將來㗎，佢覺得呢個同學同埋佢個 lover， 因為呢個同學亦都好大膽去講佢自己同佢 lover 嗰啲關係嘅，佢同佢硬撐咯，佢就明知個社工係 buy 佢嗰個關係嘅同性關係，但係佢就同佢係死咁撐嘅，咁就同 Fiona 講晒佢啲最 deep 嗰啲 detail 嘅，關於佢哋嗰個關係 sex 有講，或者即係一般生活有講嘅。同埋亦都講俾 Fiona 聽咧，話我將來即係我一定咧就會係同呢個我嘅男朋友一齊咧就有美好嘅將來嘅。我哋畢業之後咧，我哋就揾份好工啦，買樓啦，買車啦，仲會周圍去旅遊添嘅，好開心㗎啦將來。但係咧，我嘅男朋友唔好彩地咧係個基督徒喺個 church 裏面嘅，咁我就要救翻佢出嚟㗎啦。咁所以佢就要揾，佢就咁樣就因為咁樣而去揾阿 Fiona 嘅，因為 Fiona 自己係話自己係虔誠基督徒，咁佢就要從阿 Fiona 身上面咧就諗啲辦法去救佢嘅男朋友嘅。咁阿 Fiona 嗰陣時聽到啦，我同佢傾偈嗰陣時候咧，咁我問 Fiona 咁你點去handle 呢個 case 啦？咁 Fiona 嗰陣時就講到絕望嘅，佢覺得佢哋冇未來㗎，係啊，佢覺得佢好傷心。呢對男同志咧係覺得自己有咁美好嘅將來，佢反而覺得佢哋應該係立得灰啲嘅。咁就係因為佢哋有咁好嘅 plan 啊，呢兩個男仔，尤其是呢個男仔啦嚇，佢咁好嘅 plan，呢樣嘢令到 Fiona 好焦慮嘅，佢好擔心佢係啦佢哋嘅。咁喺我同佢傾偈嗰陣時候咧，我就問 Fiona，咁如果佢哋係一男一女嘅話，你會唔會有同樣嘅焦慮，或者會唔會對佢係咁樣同樣嘅態度咧？咁 Fiona 又好直接咁同我講喎，話唔會。如果佢一男一女咧，我一定 bless 佢嘅，係個 blessing 嚟嘅，係啊。我亦都好開心，佢哋將來會一齊揾工，申請公屋又好，或之後買樓啊、買車啊，咁將來發達啊、去旅遊啊嗰啲，唔會覺得係一個問題嚟㗎，係啊。但係就係因為佢哋兩個係一對咁後生中學生男同志，咁諗到將來嘅男同志，仲係咁陽光嘅男同志啦。雖然佢戒手，大家要記住佢係戒手戒到好多次入醫院㗎，佢係一定係好辛苦嘅成個過程裏面喺中學嘅過程裏面啦嚇。咁喺從呢個訪談裏面咧，我就發現其實咧就係令到我諗起 personhood 啊，即係有可能有啲同Mikee 頭先講嗰種 personhood 有啲唔同，但係亦都令我諗起就係即係當然我哋成日喺 queer studies 上面講嘅 queer future 啦，或者係究竟啲乜嘢人可以喺香港生活，其實即係睇得闊啲嘅話，其實就係乜嘢嘅青少年可以喺香港係有 support 嘅，咩青少年係唔會係被邊緣化嘅？我哋係點樣去 即係唔係話好老土去講話孕育下一代，但係只不過係從一個比較即係 youth empowerment 嘅 model 或者去諗究竟我哋係咁點樣對呢個youth 嘅 sexuality 咧去點睇？成件事都令我諗到即係比較闊啲嘅觀點啦。咁而喺呢個研究裏面咧，我都發覺有好多人咧，當佢哋諗到即係讀中學嘅同志嘅身份嗰陣時候咧，而如果佢哋知道佢哋亦都係自殘嘅話咧，佢哋就覺得咧，通常自殘咧就係中學或者小學會做嘅嘢，而你係攣嘅咧，佢哋都會覺得有一部分嘅攣嘅小朋友們咧，都係中學或者小學只會係攣嘅啫。即係到佢讀完中學，尤其是讀完啲女校、男校嗰啲咧，出嚟就自然咬翻直㗎啦，係啦，冇事嘅咁嘅。咁呢個就好即係呢個 notion 好明顯係好 parallel 嘅。我同佢哋傾偈嗰陣時，佢哋就係咁諗㗎啦，係啦，咁冇嘢㗎，係啊，佢哋唔介自己嗰陣時，跟住又冇乜嘢咁，你真係將來出翻嚟都係一個好正常嘅香港人咁樣諗嘅。咁另外一樣嘢，我覺得都有啲surprising 嗰方面咧。其實就係當然大家都知道，即係如果你話女同志同男同志係被視作係容易比較上係自殘或者係自殘行為嗰方面咧，個風險咧係大嘅。而呢啲社工或者同我傾偈嘅 service provider 都認同係大啲嘅。但係其中另外一個 case 咧，就係有一位社工咧係喺嗰啲即係最 top 嗰啲 elite 嗰啲學校裏面做嘅。咁佢就反而佢就覺得啲女仔佢接觸嘅女同志，即係依間女校名校裏面咧，亦都有宗教背景嘅名校裏面咧，就真係發現都幾多女仔係會戒手嘅。咁反而咧，佢嘅 reading 咧係一個即係一個社工喺一間咁 elite 嘅學校嘅 reading 咧，佢就覺得咧，佢哋見到血嗰陣時咧好興奮嘅，因為佢平時太乖呢啲學生，讀書又叻，係啦，讀書又叻啦，樣樣嘢即係。品行上面嗰啲，即係對 public 個 appearance 係好 OK 嘅，係啊。咁佢哋但係咧私底下咧戒手呢樣嘢就係令到佢哋最興奮嘅一樣嘢嚟㗎。見到血或者係真係嗰樣就係佢哋嘅 resistance 個 rebellion 個反抗嗰方面咧，就喺呢度睇得出嚟嘅。咁我覺得呢個都有少少吻合翻，即係你話 Western clinical literature 講 self-harm 或者即係你話即係中產白女仔嗰樣嘅。但係喺香港個 context 嘅乖女係啦，讀書又叻，又喺啲名校畢業嗰啲，或者名校嗰度讀咗好耐嗰啲人，點樣去用即係點樣去戒自己身體仲要係匿埋喎，即係你戒咗你知香港熱㗎嘛，啲 uniform 睇到㗎嘛，咁所以又有啲名校啲 uniform 透明㗎嘛，咁所以就要點樣去遮掩呢啲 strategy， 其實係即係好聽嚟講就係。唔應該話 fascinating， 但係就係好令到我覺得真係會想研究多啲嘅，會想理解多啲佢哋咁樣嘅，因為自殘係睇到㗎嘛，係有疤痕，即係唔同第二種嘅即係 self-harming behaviour 咁樣嘅。咁所以呢幾樣嘢咧就令到我覺得我下一步去諗成個研究嗰陣時候咧，就係其實自殘係一個概念咧。係有一個當然有一個好 emotional 嘅 dimension 喺裏面嘅。個 physicality 就當然就係你話 harming 你嘅身體啦，係咪？你可以飲酒啦，可以食煙，可以做好多樣嘢咁樣。但係嗰種 emotional 嘅自殘咧，其實都好 interesting 嘅，就係個 affect 嗰方面即係點樣去 emotionally 去令到自己咧去做呢件去傷害自己身體啦。或者 emotionally 裏面咧，你點樣去cope with 唔傷害自己身體啦？咁呢啲咧就我都覺得係即係可以再諗多啲嘅，去研究多啲嘅 area 啦。咁我諗我講到呢度應該 OK， 或者陣間再答下你啲問題。
我對Denise 個 paper 個一啲嘅想法先啦。咁喺睇個 paper 嘅過程裏邊，我睇得好 disturbing， 因為我個人嘅背景就係我有教過中學啦，咁我有同過好多唔同嘅同學傾偈，佢哋面對嘅問題係點樣樣啦，包括 self-harm 啦。咁我喺 graduate schools 嘅時候，我係做好多關於Lingnan psychoanalysis 嘅東西。咁喺 theory 嗰個部分，我有一定程度嘅 training。咁但係我發覺我翻到嚟香港嘅時候，我 我翻嚟香港嘅時候，嗰個 knowledge base 嘅 training 對於我面對個 physical reality 係當然係幫唔到嗰件事咯，甚至乎幫唔到我自己咯。咁我面對有好多嘅困難，我係解決唔到。咁後嚟to make a long story short 就係我走咗去做一啲其他嘅healing 嘅 exploration。咁喺嗰個過程裏邊，我就發覺到好多真係可以將嗰個theoretical knowledge 點樣將佢運用喺我哋個社會嗰度，同埋去幫到自己之餘幫到其他人。咁所以翻轉頭講翻 Denise 個 paper 咧，就係、有兩個 key issue 所想raise 嘅，一就係、因為我 recently 我最近就睇緊一啲關於 post-secular politics 嘅 discourse 嘅，咁喺嗰樣嘢裏邊，我就會好 question 到底因為你喺呢個 paper 裏邊 religion 其實係一個 almost is like a kind of public enemy for these self-harmers，right？ 咁所以我唔知道你有冇 consider 到，即係其實喺 political theology 個 discourse 裏邊，嗰件事已經發展到其實 religion 本身係一個即係好似今朝個 session 咁講，佢其實係一個 empty signifier 嚟嘅。咁喺呢個 empty signifier 底下，我哋仲有一啲乜嘢嘢唔係其他 religion 喎，只不過係喺呢個 empty signifier 裏邊，或者under 呢一個 signifier。我哋仲有啲乜嘢嘢嘅 alternative 係其實可以俾到一啲 quote unquote as you said blessing 呢啲 self-harmers 咧？因為喺我自己個日常嘅生活個 practice 裏邊，其實我而家係 heavily involved with local 好多 so-called 嘅 spiritual 嘅 NGOs 嘅。咁我亦都有教一啲嘅 spiritual courses。咁我發覺係真係幫到呢啲人。咁所以我就覺得，即係我哋要好小心去諗一諗，即係 religion 作為一個 empty signifier，outside of it 或者 within 佢本身個 realm， 我哋仲有一啲乜嘢嘢嘅 political contingency 同埋 political complexity， 我哋需要去 address 嘅。咁呢個係其中一個 dimension 我想帶出㗎啦。咁第二個 dimension 咧就係係啦，就係都係同 psychoanalysis 有關嘅，就係、是、你提到嗰個 definition of self-harm。咁我試下揾翻先啦。係，咁你嗰個就係、我讀翻你原文啦，我驚住搞錯咗。你嗰個英文係咁樣寫嘅 ：For this study, I adopt the definition of self-harm, which refer to quote intentional injury to the outside of the body, mainly through cutting, but including scratching, burning, biting and hitting. 咁呢一個 quotation 裏邊，我諗到嘅其他嘅一啲嘅 issue， 我覺得需要係 address 嘅咧，就係第一，呢個 intentional 呢個字好 problematic， 係因為喺 psychoanalysis 裏邊，佢 exactly 嗰個 focus。當然佢有佢 cognitive 嘅 aspect，which 就係我哋整體香港嗰個即係 service provider， 佢哋嗰個 acquire skill more or less 其實都係好 exclusively 係一個 cognitive 嘅 training 嚟嘅。咁變咗嗰個 unconscious 嗰個部分去咗邊咧？因為你講翻轉頭就係話嗰個問題就係我 self-harm， 我知道我搞到我一身血，搞到我係。即係嗰個 corporeal mutilation 係可以嚴重到我要 repeatedly 去入院嘅時候，咁我係知道嗰個 magnitude of or the seriousness of the issue, right? About the self-mutilation. But at the same time, knowing very well that 呢一個係一個咁 destructive 嘅 behaviour, I still choose to do it. And right now I'm sort of like into this like Tse-Shang，you know， 即係嗰個 mode 就係Tse-Shang 就係講緊嗰樣嘢。我 psychoanalysis 就係話緊俾我哋聽，我明知但係我故犯啊嘛。咁佢既然佢知道佢自己嗰個 即係嗰個 behaviour 係咁 destructive 嘅時候，佢仍然係去走去做喎。咁變咗喺呢一個理解裏邊 if we put this back into this context of psychoanalysis, so is this word intentional becomes, I mean, to what degree does this word intentional becomes highly politicized and problematic? This is the second question that I want to raise about the paper. And there are a lot others, but I want to stop it there. 咁跟住就係Mikee 嘅 paper. So I will change channel again. So I will switch to entirely English. Thank you for the really comical and entertaining paper. Not so much criticism, but my response to your paper, it's really more or less coming from cinema studies. Because I see that what you're trying to do, if I'm reading it correctly or listening to it correctly, is that you're trying to produce a different discourse to create a kind of disidentification from what you said as, I wrote somewhere. The policing based on essentialized identity, right? So if that is the case, that this identification is the target of the whole project, then I have two theoretical critique, as it were, that I would like to pose on the table. The first one is that, again, it has, that is the mirror phase, right? According to Lacan. And then we also have the symbolic identification. But most importantly for the Lacanians, we also have the quote-unquote the real identification, which is the most elusive term in Zizek as well as Lacan, because they keep changing the definition of what real identification is. So I wonder in your project if you have considered perhaps all these three levels apart, I mean, from what I would assume that your project is based on imaginary identification. So what about the symbolic and what about the real, which is the most elusive, but it doesn't mean that it is imaginary or illusion, right? The real is something that is still like a bodily presence within the symbolic. So that's the Lacanian critique. And then from the second perspective of cinema study is that Deleuze, in his two wonderful cinema books, he also talks about affects as a possible means of rejecting that imaginary identification. So that goes into the very heart of your project, because I think that in the definition of gender identity in your paper and as well as sexual orientation in your paper, both of these two definitions, you mentioned something about emotions. So I wonder if you can make it clearer whether there is a possible emotive or affective connection between your definition. Because for the first one, gender identity, you said each person's deeply felt internal and individual experience of gender. So that's the emotional aspect. And then for sexual orientation, it's defined as each person's capacity for profound emotional and affectional sexual orientation. So I wonder if you could address from these two theoretical perspectives about the issues that are raised. I think we'll stop it here. Thank you.
I kind of want to respond to.
Very quickly, because we have only 10
Yeah, very
minutes.
quickly, my response to the second question, which is Deleuze. I haven't considered Deleuze yet, but the quotations that I cite are actually not from me, but from the Judge-Carter principles. So those words are not mine. The profound, the deeply emotional, keme, as we say in sword speak. These are not my words, these are from the Judge Carter principles, which I actually try to challenge in my research because I don't think that these principles are universally applicable, because that's actually part of the Judge Carter principles. They're supposed to be universal categories, and I don't think they're very universal at all. And the first one, about Lacan and the unconscious, I'm actually going into that for my second term. So maybe we can talk next year. Thank you.
首先，thank you Anthony 即係我嘅問題啦，係啊。咁我其實喺你第一條問題，sorry 講得慢啲，係你第一條問題講關於即係嗰個即係 religionist 即係比較即係 totalizing 咁去講。喺呢份 paper 裏邊，咁都係嘅，即係其實我諗我講關於 religion 喺呢份 paper 裏面咧，就唔係講 spirituality 嘅，因為我係 understand 即係好多 spiritual 嘅 NGO 啊，或者有啲 service provider 即係同我啲 informant 裏面係覺得自己係比較 spiritual 嘅，但係唔係 organized religion 嗰隻，係啦。咁佢哋個睇法就好唔同，佢哋就係會即係當然係比較係supportive 好多啊，或者佢哋睇成件事，佢哋點樣睇 self-harm 或者點樣睇 same-sex sexuality 都好唔同嘅。咁但係即係譬如我舉嘅例子嗰啲就係比較係真係你話比較係應該好多時係比較真係conservative 嘅 Christian 或者係 right-wing fundamentalist 嗰隻就會去咁樣睇呢件事。咁可能我係真係抽樣嗰陣，即係將佢哋即係 highlight 咗多啲啦，就反而就冇寫到好多係真係比較 spiritual 嘅NGO 嘅 service provider 嗰啲。Which I guess would be 即係可以做一個 second paper 或者即係再延伸落去下一方面，即係下一次做呢個 part 2嘅時候。咁喺你第二條問題講關於即係 intentional 嘅 injury 嗰度咧，係即係你個提問係好好嘅。即係其實我點解 quote 嗰句咧，就因為其實喺成個 self-harm 嘅 literature 裏邊咧，就只不過有真係好少人用呢個數字嘅 approach 即係咁樣去講啦。咁而通常用一個 clinical 嘅definition 去講 self-harm 啦。咁 intentional 嘅字係 problematic 嘅，係 in this sense 咁樣。咁但係好多時咧，我訪問啲 service provider 嗰陣時候咧，佢哋就係真係佢哋嘅眼光去睇咧，就覺得呢位同學咧就係 intentional 去戒自己，即係咁樣去睇嘅。但係當然我如果再去訪問啲同學嗰陣時候，我就會覺得嗰種 intentional 係 problematic 啦，係未必係 conscious 啦，亦都係好多另外嘅 factor 係psychological 又好，或者係即係 unintentional 或者另外嘅 factor 又好，係令到佢哋要戒自己，甚至乎我諗到亦都有一個好大嘅 pleasure 去戒自己嘅。咁所以嗰種 injury 咧，我唔係覺得係話 always 咁 negative 嘅 injury 嚟嘅，因為成件事都可以係好 pleasurable 嘅 in some ways 係。如果唔係都唔會繼續戒啦，係咪？係啊。咁所以係咯，即係我諗我會再去睇翻即係個 word of intentional。Thanks。
請問有冇問題 ？Anyone would want to ask questions or share your thoughts and so on？ 有冇你想幫忙 ？I have one. 我 sorry。我有一個好 naive 嘅 question about intention and self-harm。self-harm 會唔會變成係一種所謂 compulsory disorder 咁咪唔係 intentional 啦？
有咁我諗有啲人會理解係咁嘅，即係又係，但係又咁樣跳翻落去一種好 clinical 嘅理解，係啊，跌翻落去就變咗係好似一個個人嘅問題咯。即係我個人好 compulsive， 我個人所以做啲咁嘅，而我諗我就係想希望係令到佢係睇得多係比較 structural 嘅問題咯，係啊，可能未必做得好好，暫時。
其實我想問，我想問咧，唔好意思啊，唔係因為我想，即係因為你可能而家你睇翻主要係睇翻即係個 service provider 點樣去 perceive 佢哋嘅資產啦。咁但係我覺得即係如果係，即係或者你即係 for 你自己 information 或者即係其實我覺得因為資產其實本身，例如話你而家係 focus on 即係outwardly 係 physical 即係睇到嘅嗰種資產啦。咁亦都其實即係資產分好多種啦，即係可能戒手同拗同搣同辣或者即係已經係好唔同啦，咁同埋即係可能有其他 form of 資產係比較冇咁 冇咁容易睇到，但係亦都係同樣 physical 嘅。咁我覺得如果你可以研究比較清楚裏面嗰種心理狀態，例如話可能咧出聲扣喉咁先算啦。咁扣喉其實嗰個人係好 obviously physically 會俾你睇到佢係會受咗好多，咁但係佢嗰個傷痕又唔係 exactly 係好。佢係冇outward wound 俾你睇到，咁嗰種心態可能會比較 complex 啲。咁如果係咯，just for 可能加翻落去，會清楚啲。
同埋我都想補充一樣嘢，就係喺又係都係 definitional 嘅問題啦。即係喺自殘呢個 term 裏邊，其實你仲會 include 啲乜嘢？冇咁 traditional 冇咁傳統嘅一啲嘅行為咧。譬如當然我就係諗緊我都係一路睇緊嘅一啲嘅書籍啦。譬如我其中一個 professor 咁佢寫咗本書叫 Unlimited Intimacy， 係講the politics of barebacking 嘅。咁有好多嘅男同志係intentionally 啦，就係我要去揾一個 HIV 嘅 virus， 我要令到自己本身唔係 HIV positive， 都變成 HIV positive， 就成為一種 alternative 嘅 kinship。咁嗰個可唔可以係一個都 kind as 一個自殘嘅一個另類啲嘅自殘嘅方法咧？同埋佢哋係 refuse intentionally 係 refuse 去接受治療嘅喎。佢覺得我有咗呢一個嘅 virus 嘅時候，我就好似有咗個 BB 咁樣，佢個 destruction 喺我個身體嘅 destruction 其實係一個我哋覺得係一種 pleasure 嚟嘅，用翻Lacan 講嘅就係一 jouissance 係 pleasurable pain。
我答 Sonia 先得㗎。OK。
我想加翻少少，就係你哋頭先不停咁講個 pleasurable， 我又覺得冇咁大咯。我唔知啊，或者個 pleasure， the role of pleasure within 嗰個自殘嘅行為，起碼如果你係一個 external 嘅觀感，除咗自己界同自己睇到之外，咁佢as一個 social gesture， 會俾人睇到㗎嘛呢件事，I don't know， 我唔覺得 pleasure 會咁大咯，比較 personal opinion 啊。
我覺得頭先Sonia 講關於將佢睇埋另外一啲嘅自殘行為，例如扣喉啊嗰啲咧，其實嗰啲link with 你話 body image 啊或者 gender expression 咧，咁呢啲都好有趣嘅，我覺得亦都係可以真係闊啲咁去睇嘅。但係因為喺自殘嘅暫時，我諗喺香港做呢個研究嘅領域，開始咁樣做嗰陣時候，我要先把佢先將佢比較係manageable 先，跟住之後再闊咁去睇，係啊。如果唔係就其實好難去跳出，因為已經喺香港有一班人做好 clinical 嘅 studies 自殘，係啊，咁但係我覺得係好 balance 嘅，你話扣喉啊，另外一啲我哋睇唔到嘅自殘，或者 emotional 嘅 abuse 啊啲，另外一啲嘢係好 balance 嘅，我覺得係啊。但係咧 barebacking 係另外一件事嚟嘅，我覺得係啊，我覺得呢個係我會好 hesitant 去覺得係真係。暫時去將佢規劃為呢種咁樣，我哋理解嘅自殘行為。但係 it's very complicated 啦。你已經 point out 咗，係比較 complicated 嘅。咁我覺得係好 deal with 好多另外一啲 issue 啊，亦都係關於嗰個 condition of HIV/AIDS 喺 current time 係啦，而點樣去令到會有呢個 phenomenon of barebacking，or maybe it's not the current phenomenon 係啦 of barebacking。
I thank you for the two papers and for the commentary. And I was wondering if maybe you could say something, maybe say a little bit more about, because you both speak of specific kinds of personhood and what modes of personhood that then feel that they can maybe even judge or obstruct other personhoods. And it sounds, from Mikee's paper, I heard that you are speaking of historical forces that result in certain understandings of personhood not being able to enter a modern governable identity. Whereas and policed even by modern, perhaps, social movements. Whereas in Denise's paper, I heard of the invisibility of a kind of institutionalized religious personhood, but the invisibility of that religion and that spirituality in entering even social work and sociology, so that social helpers may not be able to critically reflect. And it sounds like there is a little bit of an overlap here, because it sounds like Christian modern is in both cases one, invisible, even in terms of a knowledge, but in the other case, this is Mikee, this is what you are kind of critically thinking. Yeah.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That was so brilliant. Thank you for that. One of the things that I became interested in is the idea that homophobia can only be applicable. Homophobic people are all straight people. That homophobia only operates from one straight person to a queer person, when in fact it doesn't. Even within the queer communities, there are forces that police practices of gender and sexuality, to the point that some of the local practices and discourses are disprivileged or disempowered from mainstream human rights movements, and I think that's very, very problematic. And there are, of course, in the Philippines, especially in the Philippines, there are movements that try to kind of point that out and question, why are you excluding us? So why do I have to be mainstream? Why do I have to be middle class? Why do I have to be upper class? Why can't I be poor and queer and happy and deserve the same rights as you do, right? So even within these queer communities in the Philippines, there's very, very heavy policing of sexuality and gender identification. So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's also a very, very brilliant question, of course, to think about personhood from the other side, I think, when you talk about it. And I really, it bothers me a lot when I was doing these ethnographic interviews, when you're facing, some of them are blatantly homophobic, and that when you ask that question, the first thing I try to think is, I think part of it, and I'm reading it as such, I think maybe part of it is when they are serving young people who are now getting more and more articulate about their sexualities, who are more and more empowered about their sexualities through recent events in Hong Kong, through the recent mainstreaming of lesbian and gay sexualities in Hong Kong, that they've been able to articulate it better. So for these service providers, they fear, I think, is basically acting out on their insecurity of themselves as well as insecurity about the role of the jobs, the steadiness, stability of the jobs, to be able to serve them. And I think that's when they have to feel that they had to fall back on religious rhetoric, whether they really believe it or not, actually, right? Whether they consciously are believing in it, But they have to do that during the interview with me, to say that at least the representation of it as such. Yeah. But that's a great question.
It seems that the discussion is more or less, I don't know, time to wrap up or something. Okay, I'll discuss it. Denise, do you have any further comments? Mikee? Oh, okay, yeah, okay. All right, so it's time to enjoy tea and, anyway, refreshment time, 15 minutes. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.